It was a stormy night. The kind of night where the wind howls through the trees, and the rain slashes against the windows like frantic fingers trying to get in. Inside, the house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the roof. I was in my room with my younger cousin, who was barely 5 or 6 years old, her wide, innocent eyes reflecting the faint glow of the dim lamp. My older sister, at 14, was in the next room, probably lost in her own world, unaware of what was unfolding just beyond the door. It felt like any other quiet evening, except for one thing: the presence of something wrong. You can feel it, can't you? That icy chill in the air that tells you something's out of place, something lurking, waiting. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. Something wasn't right. I sat on the bed, fiddling with my phone, when I turned to my cousin and said, "Hey, I'll play some music, yeah?" It was meant to break the silence, give us something to distract ourselves from the storm outside. But before I could even unlock the screen, she whispered, so softly that it sent a shiver down my spine, "Don't do that." I froze, blinking at her. "Why not?" I asked, confused, but there was something about her expression that felt off. It wasn't fear, it was more like a warning, a strange urgency in her eyes that didn't match her small, childlike features. She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a breath. "She doesn't like being woken up." A cold wave of confusion washed over me. "Who?" I whispered back, more out of curiosity than fear. I looked at her, expecting her to say something about a character from a cartoon or a game. But her eyes were so serious, so unblinking. She answered, her voice steady and without hesitation, "Valentina, my sister." My stomach dropped. Valentina? My cousin didn't have a sister. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask her what on earth she was talking about, but before I could form the words, she whispered again, as if speaking a dark secret that was too heavy for anyone else to know. "She's here, she doesn't like to be disturbed." For a moment, everything around me seemed to blur, like the room itself was holding its breath. My hands went cold, and the familiar sounds of the rain suddenly became distant, muffled, as if they were being drowned by the pounding of my own heart. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just a child's imagination, but something in the air felt wrong, heavier. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was some kind of strange game or dream she had been playing, but her words clung to me like ice. "Who is she really?" I asked, trying to laugh it off, trying to convince myself that I wasn't scared. But my cousin didn't answer, she just stared at me, her gaze intense, unblinking. "Valentina," she repeated again, her voice softer this time, like a whisper from a far-off place. My pulse quickened. I could feel my breath catching in my throat. What was happening? Was she just playing, or was there something more to this? My rational mind screamed at me to ignore it, but my instincts told me something was far off from anything I could explain. I glanced around the room, the shadows seeming to grow longer, darker. I decided to drop the subject, trying to push the chill away. The air had thickened, the silence now deafening. I wanted to get back to normal, to hear the music, to push away the strange sensation that something unseen was waiting, lurking just outside the door. But I couldn't. Not after hearing those words, Valentina. Suddenly, the sound of thunder cracked through the air, snapping me back into reality. My cousin, blissfully unaware, had fallen asleep on the bed, her small form curled up like a child who had just seen a nightmare, or perhaps one who was dreaming of something far worse. I lay there wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, the storm outside now a distant hum in my ears. But I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. And the name Valentina kept echoing in my mind, a name I hadn't expected to hear, one that was tied to something darker, something I couldn't yet comprehend. That night, as the storm raged on, I lay awake, my mind racing with questions, but knowing deep down that the answers I sought would only lead me deeper into terror. Something was in the house with us, something that was never meant to be there. And I would soon find out that the presence of Valentina was only the beginning of the nightmare that was unfolding, just outside the edge of my understanding. As I stared into the dark corners of the room, the fear started to settle in. The door to the hallway creaked. A cold draft swirled through the room, carrying with it the faintest whisper, like a child's soft voice calling from the shadows. "Don't wake her up." The house was old, ancient even. You could tell by the way the floorboards groaned under every step, as if the house itself were alive, breathing in the dark, sharing its age-old secrets with those brave, or foolish, enough to listen. The walls, covered in faded wallpaper, seemed to close in as the night wore on, the flickering light of the bedside lamp casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to dance unnaturally across the room. The storm outside had reached its peak, the rain battering the windows like the frantic tapping of unseen fingers desperate to get in. Every now and then, the sound of thunder would tear through the air, rattling the panes of glass, making the house shudder as if it were waking from a nightmare. This wasn't just any house. This was a place that seemed to hold memories in every corner, memories that were long forgotten but never truly gone. It was the kind of house that spoke in creaks and moans, its very structure holding the echoes of lives lived within its walls, lives now past, but still haunting in ways words couldn't explain. There were rooms that hadn't been used in years, closets filled with things no one dared open, and hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly, leading to places that no one could remember. I stood at the door to my room, looking down the dimly lit hallway that stretched out before me, the shadows pulling at the edges of my vision like dark hands, as if the house itself were alive, waiting, watching. The air felt thick, heavy, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to make a move. The only sound, besides the storm outside, was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. The clock had been there for as long as I could remember, but tonight it seemed louder, its ticking echoing through the silence, as if counting down to something inevitable. The room I was in was small, cluttered with old furniture that had seen better days. A worn-out armchair sat in the corner, its fabric threadbare and stained from years of use. The bed, where my cousin slept, was draped with faded sheets that seemed too thin for the cold night air that had begun to seep into the room. There was an old dresser against the far wall, its wood scratched and chipped, and a mirror above it, its surface cloudy and streaked, as though it had witnessed too many things it wasn't meant to see. I could feel the chill in the air, the kind that didn't come from the storm outside but from something deeper, something that wasn't supposed to be here. The house, old as it was, held an unsettling presence, a quiet hum that seemed to vibrate in the air, just beneath the surface, like a whispered warning. The longer I stayed, the more I could feel the weight of the house pressing in, as if the walls themselves were closing in, trapping me inside with whatever force resided here. The window to the room, although shut tight, rattled with each gust of wind, sending a cold draft into the room, making the curtains sway ever so slightly, as if something was standing just outside, waiting for the right moment to enter. I glanced over at my cousin, still sound asleep, her small form tucked under the blankets. She looked so innocent, so peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt wrong, like a living, breathing entity, and it was aware of us. It had been aware of us long before we had ever stepped inside. As I stood there, trying to shake the unease gnawing at my mind, I noticed the time on my phone, 9:53 p.m. The moment I saw it, a strange sense of dread washed over me. Why did it feel like the storm had been raging for so much longer? Why did the house feel so much colder than before? My fingers curled around the edge of the doorframe, and I instinctively stepped back, as though something unseen were moving just behind me. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt heavier now, thicker with something I couldn't name. The house seemed to be watching me, its very bones creaking with the anticipation of something, or someone, about to make an appearance. I turned toward the room again, but this time, it felt different. The walls, which had seemed so familiar before, now felt like they were closing in on me, as if they were shrinking, pushing in from all sides. The shadows that had once been just a part of the night now seemed to have a life of their own, twisting and stretching unnaturally as they moved with the flicker of the lamplight. The distant sound of thunder now seemed like a warning, like a signal from some unseen force telling me that something was about to happen, something that was not meant to be. My cousin, still asleep, murmured something in her sleep. I couldn't make out the words, but they were too soft, too strange. She turned her head, and for just a moment, I thought I saw her eyes flicker open, her wide, innocent gaze locking with mine. But no, she was still asleep. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was aware of something I couldn't see. The longer I stayed, the more the house seemed to close in on me, the air growing thick with tension, as if something was building, something dark, something ancient, something that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And it was clear now, the house wasn't just old, it was alive. It had a presence, a consciousness of its own, and it had been watching me, waiting. I could feel it just beneath the surface, like a heartbeat, slow and steady, yet filled with purpose. And in that moment, as the wind howled outside and the house creaked and groaned, I knew one thing for certain: we weren't alone. The quiet hum of the house, which had been so familiar, now seemed unnatural, as if it were holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind, but the sensation of something being off lingered. I glanced over at my cousin, who still lay asleep on the bed, her breathing steady and calm. But there was a stillness in the room, a weight in the air, that told me something was waiting to break the silence. The rain had become a constant, rhythmic tapping against the windows, but as I focused on the sound, it began to feel almost too regular, too deliberate. It wasn't just the sound of rain anymore. It was like someone was gently knocking on the glass from the outside. Tap, tap, tap. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen, staring at the window, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I was sure it was the wind or the storm, but it sounded wrong, like something was trying to communicate with me from beyond the glass. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I turned away from the window and went to adjust the lamp by the bed. But as my hand reached for the switch, the light flickered. Once, twice, before it went out entirely, leaving the room bathed in nothing but darkness. My pulse quickened, and my breath hitched in my chest. I didn't remember the lamp ever flickering like that before. The house, once again, seemed to be alive, its very walls creaking in response, like some ancient thing waking from a long slumber. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched unnaturally, twitching at the edges of my vision, as if they were watching me. I fumbled around in the dark, my hands grazing over the dresser, searching for a flashlight. When I finally found it and clicked it on, the beam illuminated the room in harsh, jagged light. For a brief moment, the light cut through the shadows, pushing them back into the corners of the room, but the sense of unease, the feeling of being watched, remained. And then I heard it, a faint, distant whisper. Soft at first, like a breath against the wind, but growing louder, closer. It wasn't just the wind or the house settling, it was a voice. A voice that seemed to call out, not in words, but in a low, rhythmic murmur, as though something was trying to speak from the other side of the wall. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, my heart pounding in my chest as the whisper grew clearer. I turned quickly toward my cousin, who was still lying in the bed, her eyes shut, her small body curled up beneath the covers. Was it her? Was she the one whispering? I crept closer, trying not to make a sound, my eyes never leaving her form. But no, she was sound asleep, her face peaceful, untouched by the eerie presence that filled the room. I held my breath and listened again. The whispering continued, now unmistakable, soft but insistent. It's her. The words came to me not in the whisper, but in my own mind. Something felt familiar, something was tugging at the edge of my memory. The voice seemed to be speaking directly to me, knowing exactly where to hit. The chill in the room deepened, as though the very air had grown colder, heavier. The whisper didn't stop, though I tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away on its own. I moved toward the window again, hoping the storm outside would explain everything, but the rain had stopped. The house was silent again, but for the whisper, still hanging in the air. Then, just as I thought I could no longer stand it, it stopped, abruptly. In the silence that followed, the room felt more suffocating than before, every creak of the house now seeming louder, every shadow feeling more oppressive. I turned to leave, to get away from the weight of the air, but as I reached for the door handle, I stopped. From the corner of my eye, I saw it, the mirror above the dresser. The glass, dimmed by years of grime, now seemed to shimmer, ever so slightly, as if something within it had stirred. The faintest reflection moved, just at the edge of my vision, too quick to register, but I saw it. I didn't move at first. I stared, frozen, as if something was drawing me in, pulling me closer. The room felt smaller now, as though the very walls were inching toward me. My breath grew shallow, and I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my chest as I slowly turned toward the mirror. And that's when I saw it. A shape, barely discernible, standing behind me. In the reflection, there was no one else in the room but me. But I could feel it. Someone or something was standing there just out of reach. The hairs on my neck prickled, and I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing. The room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, but this time I couldn't look away. Something was wrong with it, something was off. The air around it shimmered, as though the reflection was starting to bend and distort. And then, like a sudden rush of cold wind, a shape moved in the glass, a figure in the reflection, just beyond the frame, staring directly at me. But no one was there. My chest tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The whispering started again, this time much louder, clearer, almost deafening in my ears. "She's awake," the voice hissed, and I could feel the blood drain from my face as I realized who the voice belonged to. Valentina. I stood there, paralyzed, staring into the mirror, unable to look away from the figure that wasn't there. My breath caught in my throat as the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was like an icy hand gripping my chest, squeezing the air out of my lungs. "She's awake." The voice, familiar yet completely alien, echoed in my mind. Valentina. But she wasn't supposed to be here. She couldn't be here. She had been gone for years, or so I thought. The room seemed to shrink around me as the tension in the air thickened, each passing second stretching out longer than the last. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my body frozen in place as my mind raced with fear and confusion. My heart pounded, and my mind screamed at me to leave the room, to run away, to scream for help, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The whispers became clearer now, as though they were coming from behind me, from within the walls, or worse, from the very air around me. She's here. She's always been here. She's waiting. I glanced over at my cousin, still asleep, oblivious to the terror unfolding in the room. How could she sleep through this? How could she not feel what I was feeling? The very air around us felt charged like static electricity just before a storm, and I could sense it. Something was about to happen. I didn't want to face it, but deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know the truth. I had to know what was happening. The conflict inside me raged like a storm, tearing at my resolve. On one hand, I wanted to pretend it was all a dream, a trick of the mind, to shut my eyes and hope that everything would go back to normal. But on the other hand, I couldn't deny the growing sensation of dread that clung to me, the feeling that if I didn't confront whatever was in this house, whatever had awakened, I would never leave this place. I could feel the walls closing in, the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on me, suffocating me with its dark secrets. Should I wake my cousin? Should I leave? Should I scream for my sister for help? The thoughts twisted in my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to act. I felt like a puppet, caught in the grip of something far more powerful than myself. The whispers, now sharper, seemed to taunt me, urging me to open the door to what lay behind it. I could almost hear them. "Don't be afraid. Come closer. See for yourself." I took a shaky step forward, my hand reaching for the door handle, but the cold sensation in the room was unbearable, as though the very air had turned to ice. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I felt something brush against me, something unseen, yet unmistakable. A gust of wind, or maybe a touch like a whisper against my skin. My heart skipped a beat as I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the cold emptiness of the room. The pressure in my chest grew unbearable. What if it wasn't just a memory? What if Valentina was here, really here? The thought sent a shock of terror through my veins. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand. I couldn't let fear dictate my actions anymore. I had to confront this, whatever this was. Taking a deep breath, I turned away from the door and toward my cousin, still asleep, her face serene and unaware. I felt a pang of guilt twist in my gut. Should I wake her? Should I tell her what was happening? But I knew deep down that whatever this was, it had nothing to do with her. It had to do with me. I was the one who had been chosen to see it. As I approached the bed, the room seemed to grow colder still. I hesitated, my hand hovering over my cousin's shoulder. Should I shake her awake? Should I tell her about the whispers, about Valentina? But before I could make a decision, something inside me snapped. I needed to know the truth. The fear, the confusion, all of it. It was consuming me, and I could no longer stand in the dark, wondering what was real and what wasn't. I reached out and shook my cousin's shoulder gently. At first, there was no response. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Then slowly, her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Her small, tired face blinked up at me, and I thought for a moment that it was all a mistake, that the fear had been for nothing. But then, with a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, she looked up at me with those innocent eyes and whispered, "She's awake now." Valentina's awake. My blood ran cold. The words hit me like a hammer. There was no way she could know about Valentina. There was no way she could know about the whispers, about the presence that had haunted this house for years. But she did know. And somehow in that moment, I realized that whatever was happening, whatever had been unleashed, was far beyond my understanding. I stepped back, the room spinning around me as my cousin's words echoed in my mind. I had to make a decision. But no matter what I did, I knew there was no turning back. Whatever she was, whatever Valentina was, she was now a part of this house, a part of the nightmare that was unfolding. And I was trapped, standing on the edge of a decision that would determine whether I faced the darkness head-on, or whether I ran, leaving everything behind. But running didn't seem like an option anymore. Not with Valentina so close. Not with the house so alive. The silence in the room deepened as I stood there, my mind a whirlpool of confusion and fear. My cousin's words echoed in my ears, and yet I couldn't process them. Valentina's awake. I wanted to scream, to run out of the room, to escape the suffocating presence that had settled in. But I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, as if the very air around me had turned to stone, trapping me in place. For a moment, nothing happened. The world outside the room seemed suspended, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then, just as I thought I might collapse from the overwhelming pressure in my chest, I felt it. A cold wind swept through the room, so suddenly and violently that it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The temperature dropped in an instant, the warmth of my breath turning to mist in front of my face. It was as though the room had turned into a tomb, a suffocating space where nothing could escape, least of all me. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally, curling and twisting like dark tendrils reaching for something that shouldn't be there. I turned toward the mirror once more, my eyes drawn to its dark, clouded surface. The reflection seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen hand, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something. No, someone, standing just behind me in the glass. The figure was tall, shrouded in darkness, its face hidden beneath a veil of shadows. I gasped, stumbling back, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still, like a specter from a forgotten past, watching me with an intensity that chilled me to the core. "Valentina," I whispered, my voice barely audible, the name tasting like ice on my tongue. The figure in the mirror seemed to twitch, a subtle movement that made my blood run cold. It was as if the very mirror was alive, responding to the name, to the presence that had been unleashed. The room seemed to pulse, vibrating with a low hum, as though the walls themselves were resonating with the energy of the supernatural force that had awoken. I couldn't tell if it was the storm outside or something else, something darker, but the house seemed to groan in response, as though it were alive and stretching, twisting, becoming something it wasn't meant to be. I turned to my cousin, who had now sat up in bed, her eyes wide but empty, as if she were in a trance. She stared at me, her face blank, devoid of emotion, and then, in a voice that wasn't hers, that wasn't even human, she spoke. "She's here. She's always been here, waiting for you." The words sent a jolt of terror through me, and for the first time, I truly understood. Valentina wasn't just a name. She wasn't just a memory. She was something else entirely, something that had been buried in this house for years, and now it had been awakened. And I had unknowingly summoned it by speaking her name. Suddenly, the air became thick, suffocating, as though every breath I took was laden with dread. I could feel the presence in the room now, tangible and real. It wasn't just the mirror, it was the house, the very foundation beneath my feet. The shadows that had once been nothing more than a trick of the light were now alive, moving with purpose, stretching out to wrap around me. I heard the creak of the floorboards behind me, and before I could turn, I felt a cold hand press against my shoulder. The touch was light, almost gentle, but the coldness of it seeped through my clothes and into my skin, freezing me to the bone. My heart slammed in my chest as I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the flickering lamp, and the oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a weight. And then I saw it. In the doorway, standing just beyond the threshold, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and impossibly pale, it stood there watching me, its eyes black as night, staring with an emptiness that seemed to swallow everything around it. The figure was dressed in a long, flowing gown, but it was torn and tattered, like the remnants of a burial shroud. Its hair, dark and tangled, hung in loose strands, and its lips were pulled into a grotesque, silent smile. Valentina. The name whispered through my mind as I stared at the apparition before me. The figure's head tilted slightly, and I could feel its gaze piercing through me, seeing things I didn't want to show. The room seemed to close in, the walls pressing together with a low, groaning sound, as though the house itself were reacting to the presence of this thing. The shadows began to flicker and writhe around the figure, as though it were feeding off the very darkness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was trapped in place, my body frozen in terror as Valentina, the thing that was not human, stepped forward. With each step, the temperature in the room dropped lower, until I could see my breath misting in front of me. It came closer, its presence suffocating, its energy so thick that I could barely think. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but my feet refused to move. And then, as if sensing my fear, the figure spoke in a voice that was not a voice, but a whisper from the very depths of the grave, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You woke me." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. And in that moment, I realized the horrible truth. Valentina had never been gone. She had been waiting in the dark, hidden from the world, until someone like me, was foolish enough to awaken her. The room spun, the walls breathing with an unnatural rhythm, and I realized I was no longer in control. The house had claimed me. Valentina had claimed me, and there was no turning back. I had come too far, and now I would face whatever horror awaited me, trapped in the house with a presence that would never let me go. The air in the room felt like it was thickening, heavy with an oppressive force that seemed to press down on me from all sides. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow as I stared at Valentina, or whatever it was standing before me. The room had become an unholy place, the boundaries between reality and something darker blurring with every passing second. I could feel the floor beneath my feet shifting, like the house itself was alive, breathing with a malevolent intent. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer, darker, like they were pulling away from the walls, gathering into one thick mass that hovered around me. I tried to speak, to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat, choked by the weight of fear and the suffocating presence of the thing before me. It wasn't just Valentina, it was something else. Her, its eyes locked onto mine, black as the void, absorbing all light, all warmth. A cold, unnatural silence hung in the air, stretching out, suffocating me. And then, as if the air itself had become thick with its presence, it moved closer. The figure didn't walk. It glided. The sound of its movements was unnerving, silent, as though the floor beneath it was willing it forward. Every step it took felt like a violation, like the very ground was giving way beneath its unnatural weight. As it came closer, the shadows around it deepened, flickering like flames, casting grotesque, twisted shapes across the walls and ceiling. I tried to take a step back, but my feet refused to move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, held in place by some unseen force. The cold grew worse, so intense that my breath became visible, puffing out in shaky clouds of white. My teeth began to chatter, and my skin prickled, as if thousands of icy needles were piercing me from all directions. "She's awake." The voice was not my cousin's. It was something else entirely, a whisper that came from deep within the shadows. It was soft, almost sweet, like the voice of someone you once knew, someone you loved. But there was no warmth in it. There was only emptiness. The voice spoke again, its words crawling through my mind like insects. "You shouldn't have woken me." The realization hit me like a slap to the face, and I staggered back. Valentina wasn't just a ghost. She wasn't just a lost spirit of a child who had died in some forgotten tragedy. No, she was something far worse. The truth that I had been dreading for so long was now becoming clear. Valentina wasn't waiting for me because she wanted to be remembered. She was waiting because she was bound to this place, bound to this house, and when the time was right, she would reclaim it and everything inside it. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my head swimming with the overwhelming pressure of the room closing in. The whispers in the walls grew louder, almost deafening now, and I could feel the weight of them pressing against my skull. "You woke me," the voice whispered again, its presence crawling under my skin. "Now you're mine." Suddenly, there was a deafening crack of thunder, shaking the house to its core. The lights flickered again, and the shadows stretched out unnaturally, distorting into grotesque shapes. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought I saw figures, no shapes, moving in the dark corners of the room, like people trapped within the shadows, reaching out to me with desperate, twisted hands. I turned my gaze back to Valentina, or the thing that wore her face. Her body seemed to melt into the shadows around her, becoming one with the darkness. Her outline blurred, as if the boundaries of her form were constantly shifting. And then, in the reflection of the broken mirror, I saw it, the truth. A flash of memory, not my own, but of someone who had lived in this house long before me. The memory was old, so ancient it made my head spin. It was of a woman, young and beautiful, standing in the very same spot where Valentina now stood, staring into the same mirror. The woman's eyes were not the same as Valentina's. They were cold, filled with something else, something darker. This was no ordinary spirit. This was a soul that had been corrupted, bound to this place by an ancient force, a dark ritual that had taken place long before I had ever stepped foot in this house. The house was more than just haunted, it was a prison. And Valentina, or whatever had taken her form, was the keeper of this prison, the one who kept the others trapped, locked in the dark corners of the house, feeding off their fear, drawing them in with whispers and never letting them leave. I could feel the weight of her presence now, not just in the room, but in every corner of the house. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, pushing me toward her, toward the truth I had longed to escape. I had awakened something I couldn't control, something that had been lying dormant for far too long. The house groaned again, louder this time, as though it was waking up, stretching itself to its full, horrific form. And in that moment, as I felt the ground beneath me begin to crack, I understood. I had walked into a trap, one that had been set long ago, and now there was no escape. The house was alive, and Valentina was the key to its power. With a sudden, terrifying motion, Valentina reached out, her hands long and twisted, her fingers too thin, too cold. She moved toward me, her lips forming a smile that wasn't a smile at all, but a twisted mockery of one. "You are mine now," she whispered again, and I felt her touch like ice on my skin. I wanted to scream, to fight, but there was nothing left in me. I had already been claimed. The walls of the house trembled, and I knew deep down that it was too late. The house would claim me as it had claimed so many others, and I would never leave. I had come too close to the truth, and the truth was a nightmare far darker than I could ever imagine. And as the shadows closed in, I was consumed by them, the last echo of my own voice swallowed by the unholy darkness. The room spun, and my vision blurred as the suffocating weight of Valentina's presence pressed against me, a force too powerful to resist. Her fingers were cold, impossibly cold, as they wrapped around my wrist, pulling me forward. I could feel the air growing thicker, heavier, like it was turning to solid ice. The walls groaned again, this time louder, as if the house itself was stretching, warping, pulling everything into itself, claiming everything within its walls. "You are mine now," she whispered, her voice a low rasp that seemed to echo in every corner of the room. The darkness around her thickened, swirling, and the shadows seemed to breathe, following her every movement like living things, hungry for whatever she had summoned. Her face, still obscured by that cold, unnatural smile, twisted slightly, and in her eyes I saw it, the darkness that had consumed her. It wasn't just death she had faced. It was something worse, something that turned her into this, something that no longer resembled a child. I struggled, every fiber of my being screaming to break free, but her grip was unyielding. I could feel my strength draining with every second that passed, as if the very essence of my life was being siphoned away, absorbed into the shadows that encircled her. The house seemed to breathe with us, its old walls creaking and shifting, and in the distance, I could hear the soft whisper of voices, many voices, all trapped in the dark, trapped by her. For a brief, fleeting moment, my mind grasped at the thought of running, of escaping. But as I turned to look toward the door, I saw it. The hallway, the path that should have led to safety, was no longer there. The door was gone. The walls had closed in, leaving me with nowhere to go. The house had changed. It had swallowed every escape, every hope, leaving nothing but the suffocating, ever-growing darkness. It was as though the house itself was alive, feeding on my fear, on my very will to live. "It's too late," Valentina murmured, her voice low and almost tender, though it carried a chilling promise. "You woke me, and now you belong here." Her cold hand slid down my arm, and as it did, I felt a sharp, painful pull deep within my chest, as though something inside me was being torn apart. I gasped, struggling for air, but there was none. The room, the house, had become a tomb, a suffocating, eternal prison that I would never escape. The floor beneath my feet trembled, and the ceiling above me cracked open with a deafening sound, a jagged split that seemed to stretch infinitely into darkness. Through the crack, I saw the void, a pitch-black abyss that reached out, its cold fingers brushing against my skin. I could feel it pulling me toward the very heart of the house, the place where the darkness had festered for so long. A sudden, overwhelming feeling of despair washed over me, a sense that I had been doomed from the start. The house had been waiting for someone, anyone, to awaken it, to free the darkness that had been trapped within its walls for so long. And I had been the one. I had been the key. The room seemed to twist and collapse around me, the shadows becoming deeper, more oppressive. I could hear the faint whispers again, louder this time, their voices all speaking at once, murmuring in languages I couldn't understand. The floor beneath me buckled and cracked, sending a shudder through my entire body. I looked down in horror as the floor splintered, the cracks spreading like veins, revealing the darkness beneath. And then, just as I thought I could no longer bear it, the floor gave way entirely. My feet were no longer on solid ground, and I was falling, plummeting into the abyss that had been waiting for me. I could hear the house groaning, its very foundations shaking, as if it were feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every breath, every scream that tore from my throat. I tried to reach for something, anything, to hold on to, but there was nothing. The shadows consumed me, swallowing me whole, and the last thing I felt was the cold, the unbearable cold, as if I were being frozen alive, trapped in the void with Valentina, with the house. And then, all at once, everything went silent. The darkness was endless. I was weightless, floating in a vast, empty space. There were no sounds, no voices, just an oppressive, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The house, the shadows, Valentina, they were all gone. Or perhaps they had never been there at all. All I knew was the cold, the eternal, never-ending cold. And yet, as I drifted in that void, I realized something. The house had never truly let me go. It had taken me, and in a way, it was still holding me, pulling me into its heart, into its very core. I was a part of it now, bound to its darkness, just another lost soul trapped within its walls. There would be no escape, no salvation. The house had claimed me, just as it had claimed all those before me. And in that eternal silence, I understood. The terror was never meant to end. The nightmare would never truly be over. It would live on, in the house, in the dark, with Valentina. Forever. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, like an impenetrable fog that clung to everything. I had fallen into the abyss, but I couldn't tell if I was still falling or if time itself had stopped, leaving me suspended in a nightmare that had no end. My body, though I could no longer feel it, seemed to throb with an unbearable cold. I could no longer see the room, the house, or the twisted figure of Valentina. All that remained was the oppressive emptiness that swallowed everything. I don't know how much time passed, or if time even existed anymore. But eventually the darkness began to shift, to morph. I felt the weight of it pressing in on me from all sides, as though the very fabric of this place was pulling tighter, drawing me back into its center. The coldness around me seemed to grow even more intense, and I thought I heard a whisper, soft at first, a faint echo in the distance. It wasn't the same whisper I had heard before. It was different. It was my own voice, but distorted, warped. The sound of it sent a shiver of dread down my spine. "Help me!" The words echoed through the void, reverberating in my skull, forcing their way through the silence. I tried to scream, to claw my way out of the darkness, but no sound escaped my lips. I was trapped, bound to whatever this place was, unable to move, unable to escape. And then a flicker, just the faintest glimpse of light. It was so small, so far away, but I clung to it desperately. It was like a thread of hope, a promise that I was not completely lost. I moved toward it, or at least I tried. Every inch felt like I was wading through thick, oppressive tar, and yet, something was pulling me, dragging me toward that glimmer. But as I drew closer, the light began to warp, to twist into something unrecognizable. The warmth that had once seemed inviting was replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was being lured into something far worse. The light flickered again, this time revealing a shadow. No, figures, countless figures standing in the distance. They were motionless, silent, their faces obscured by the darkness, but I could feel their eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. As I drew nearer, the air around me grew thick with the stench of decay, the pungent smell of something that had been dead for far too long. My heart raced. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figures slowly began to shift, to shuffle toward me, and the cold air turned icy, each breath I took seeming to freeze my lungs. They spoke without words, their voices filling my mind in a chorus of haunting whispers. "She never leaves," they whispered. "She's always watching, always waiting." I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the terror that gripped me held me silent. I couldn't understand what they were saying. I couldn't understand why I was here, surrounded by these strange, shadowed forms. But then, as if they were reading my thoughts, one of them stepped forward, its outline barely visible in the dim, sickly light. The face was twisted, as if it had once been human, but now it was something else, something that was no longer alive, no longer even recognizable. The eyes were hollow, black pits of despair, and the mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin. "You're one of us now," it said, its voice a raspy, choking sound that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. "Welcome to the house." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The house. It had claimed me, just like it had claimed the others. I wasn't just trapped in this place. I had become a part of it, a part of its cursed, endless cycle. The house had never let me go. It had taken me, absorbed me into its darkness, and now, like the figures that surrounded me, I would never leave. I would never escape. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to break free from this nightmare. But I knew it was futile. The house had been waiting for someone to release it from its slumber, to awaken the darkness that lay buried beneath its foundations. And I had been the one. I had been the fool who thought I could escape. But now it was too late. As the figures closed in, their empty eyes never leaving me, I felt myself slipping away. The cold was unbearable, the darkness suffocating. The house whispered to me, promising that I would never escape, that I would never be free from its grip. It was as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling, pulling me deeper into its cursed heart. And in that final moment, as the shadows swallowed me whole, I understood the truth. The terror, the fear, the darkness, they were all a part of this house. A house that fed on souls, that trapped them forever within its walls, feeding off their fear, turning them into something new. I had become a part of it, a part of the house's twisted, eternal cycle. There would be no end. There would be no escape. And as the cold embraced me completely, I was consumed by the darkness, lost forever in the house that would never let me go.